The oven was still warm long after the restaurant had gone dark, and Renata Alvaro stood alone in the cold kitchen, her hands roughened by years of kneading dough, as she quietly shaped each little custard tart from the recipe her grandmother had left behind. She hummed an old Azorian lullaby, the only melody that remained from a childhood she'd lost, while the scent of Ceylon cinnamon drifted sweet into the heat. 28, widowed, raising a small daughter alone who was sleeping back home with a neighbor. Renata had grown used to a Boston that slept while she stayed awake. "You're using Ceylon cinnamon, not the ordinary kind." She nearly dropped the tray. The deep voice came from behind her, no footsteps to warn her. Adriano Vasco stood leaning against the doorway, the man the whole restaurant whispered about but no one had ever seen. 34, his black hair silvered at the temples, his dark brown eyes, nearly black, were fixed on her without blinking. His rolled-up sleeve revealed a faint old burn running along his left forearm, the mark of something he'd never told anyone. "This smell," he said softly, almost to himself. "I haven't caught it in 30 years. Renata couldn't understand why a man this powerful would stand frozen in a kitchen at midnight over a single tart, and she understood even less why, when he tasted it, the icy mask on his face cracked for a moment, as though she'd touched a wound he'd buried long ago. What she couldn't have known then was that this little tart, this very lullaby, was about to open a door into a past that belonged not just to her, but to them both, a secret hidden for 20 years, and a truth about her husband's death she'd never dared to imagine. If you love stories about resilience, loss, and healing, hit that like button to support the channel. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a heartwarming story today, and subscribe with the notification bell on so you never miss what comes next. The silence lasted long enough for Renata to hear the beating of her own heart, and when she finally dared to lift her head, Adriano was still staring at the half-finished pastry in his hand, as though it had just spoken to him in a language only he could understand. "Who taught you to make this?" he asked, his voice dropping lower, all the coldness from before gone. She wiped her hands on her apron, trying to keep her words from trembling. "My grandmother. She taught me when I was still too small to see over the kitchen counter. This recipe was hers. It isn't written in any book." He nodded slowly, his dark eyes seeming to dig into every line of her face. "What was your grandmother's name?" Renata hesitated, not understanding why such a simple question made the air in the kitchen feel so thick. "Aurora," she answered softly. "Aurora Cardoso. She died when I was 15, back in our homeland across the ocean." The moment that name left her lips, something in Adriano's eyes stirred, like still water disturbed by an invisible stone, rippling for an instant before being forced back down by an iron will. He set the pastry on the plate, with a care that felt strangely deliberate, then stepped back. "Thank you," he said. Only those 3 words. Yet they sounded as though he were closing a door that had just opened too wide. Without one explanation, without one goodbye, he turned and walked away, his tall figure disappearing into the darkness of the hallway as quickly as he had appeared, leaving Renata standing in the kitchen with a nameless confusion and the scent of cinnamon still lingering in the air. She stood there for a long while, wondering whether she had done something wrong, then shook her head and pushed that strange feeling away. She didn't have time for the mysteries of powerful men. She had more practical things to worry about. As she packed the remaining pastries into a paper box to bring home for her daughter the next morning, her mind had already drifted to the small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building in the outskirts, where little Sol was sleeping under the watch of the kind neighbor Auntie. Sol was her 5-year-old daughter, with bright eyes and a ringing laugh that could drive away all of Renata's exhaustion, but also the child whose every asthma attack made her heart tighten with fear, and with the numbers on hospital bills that kept piling higher and higher. It had been 2 years since her husband vanished from sight, 2 years of carrying alone on her thin shoulders everything a family had once shared together, and she had learned that tears couldn't pay for medicine. Only these hands, the hands calloused by flour and dishwater, could do that. Every night, when the city sank into sleep, she still stood here in someone else's borrowed kitchen, baking extra batches to sell piece by piece for a few more dollars, because a server's daytime wages were never enough. She didn't allow herself distant dreams, didn't allow herself to collapse, because at home there was a small living soul waiting for her, believing that her mother would always be there, always find a way through everything. When she locked the restaurant door and stepped out onto the cold street of the North End, her breath turning into a thin white mist in the night, she still couldn't push from her mind the image of that man, and the way he had spoken her grandmother's name, as though it carried a weight even she had never known. She had no idea that mentioning the name Aurora Cardoso that night had awakened something that had slept in silence for 20 years, and that from this moment on, the quiet life she had worked so hard to protect for her child would never be the same again. The next morning, when Renata returned to the restaurant for her daytime shift, an older woman named Dolores, who had washed dishes and helped in the kitchen here for nearly 20 years, pulled her into a corner of the cold storage room with a seriousness Renata had rarely seen on her face. "Child, I heard he came down to the kitchen to see you last night," she said, lowering her voice as though afraid even the walls had ears. Renata froze, not understanding how the news had spread so quickly. "Mr. Vasco? He only asked me about a pastry recipe." Dolores shook her head, her eyes narrowing with worry, her wrinkled hand tightening around Renata's arm. "Listen to me, and listen carefully. That man isn't just the owner of this restaurant. This restaurant, several others, and the convoys that run at night down by the harbor, all of it belongs to him, and it isn't the kind of property people show off in the light. People say that anyone who gets involved with him either gets rich very fast or disappears without a trace. 3 people worked in your position before you, and none of them lasted more than a few months, and no one dares say why they left. You're a mother. You have a little girl to care for. Don't let yourself get pulled into his world. Do your work, take your wages, then go home to your child. Don't let him notice you. Do you hear me clearly?" Renata nodded to ease the woman's mind, saying she had nothing to be involved in, that it had only been a passing question in the middle of the night, and then she returned to the stack of unwashed dishes, trying to push that warning out of her head the way one brushes a stray speck of dust from a sleeve. She told herself that rumors were never in short supply in this cramped kitchen, that people liked embroidering dramatic stories about wealthy men to pass the time, and that she had neither the time nor the strength to concern herself with a man she would probably never meet again in her life. She was so busy that whole day she almost forgot it entirely, but that night, when she finally reached her small apartment and tiptoed into her daughter's room, everything suddenly came rushing back. She stood beside the bed, watching Sol sleep deeply, her soft black hair spread across the pillow, her small chest rising and falling evenly with each breath that tonight carried no wheeze at all, and a fragile peace rose inside Renata the way it always did every night. She gently stroked her daughter's forehead, pulled the blanket higher, and that should have been the one moment of the day when she was allowed to relax, and yet Adriano's dark brown eyes kept returning to her mind again and again, impossible to drive away, not because they were frightening, but because of the opposite, because of the moment the ice on his face had cracked when he tasted the pastry, because of the way he had spoken her grandmother's name with a sound that was both stunned and wounded, as though that name had touched an old scar. Renata sat down on the edge of the bed, wrapped her arms around her own shoulders in the darkness, and a question kept growing inside her, impossible to put out. Why would a stranger know how to say her grandmother's name with such emotion? And how could a powerful man like him be so shaken by one small egg tart? She couldn't know that the night before, after leaving the kitchen, Adriano had stood for a long time by the upstairs window, silently watching her lock the door and disappear into the night, and that the meeting that seemed so accidental had not been accidental at all. Renata's phone vibrated close to midnight, just as she had finally lowered herself onto the narrow bed after a long day, and the screen lit up with an unfamiliar number, making her heart tighten by habit, the habit of someone who had grown used to receiving bad news at hours when no one expected it. "Miss Alvaro?" The voice on the other end was calm, polite, carrying an unmistakable certainty. "This is Tomas Reyes. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Vasco." Renata sat bolt upright, every trace of sleep vanishing, and Dolores's warning from that morning immediately rang through her mind. "Is something wrong?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though her heart was already in turmoil. The man explained briefly that Mr. Vasco would be hosting a private dinner at his residence over the weekend, an important reception with special guests, and he wanted Renata personally to take charge of the entire culinary portion as head chef for that evening. She almost laughed at the absurdity of the offer, because she was only a server and nighttime kitchen assistant, and had never been named head chef for any event at all. But that laugh died in her throat when Tomas calmly named the compensation, a sum 5 times greater than what she earned in an entire month of exhausting work. In that instant, the room seemed to tilt, because that number wasn't only money, it was a door out of the pit of debt that was swallowing her little by little each day. It was Sol's hospital bills possibly being paid off all at once. It was the breathing space she hadn't dared dream of for the past 2 years. "I need time to think," she said, though even she could hear the unsteadiness in her voice. And Tomas only answered politely that Mr. Vasco would wait for her reply in the morning, then ended the call, leaving her sitting there in the dark with her heart pounding and a struggle inside her that made sleep impossible. She was afraid, and that fear was real, and not without reason, because everything she knew about that man came from rumors of an underworld that a single mother like her should never have gone anywhere near, and she wondered whether accepting meant willingly stepping into a place where people could easily vanish without a trace. But then she thought of Sol, of the sleepless nights spent guarding every breath her daughter took, of the thick stack of bills hidden in a drawer that she no longer dared open and count, and the reason of a mother began to overpower her fear. The next morning, she went to her shift manager, a kind middle-aged woman named Beatriz, and told her about the offer, hoping to be advised to refuse, but Beatriz widened her eyes at her as though Renata had just dropped a gift from heaven. "Do you know Mr. Vasco has never personally invited anyone like that?" she said, lowering her voice with deep seriousness. "This isn't something you can take lightly. People line up just to cook one meal for the people in his circle, and you were invited directly. One night, child. One night equals half a year of you grinding yourself down here, enough to cover medicine for your little girl for months. Life rarely knocks twice on a poor person's door." Renata stood there, her hand tightening around the edge of her apron, and inside her, 2 versions of herself were being torn against each other. One, the woman who had learned to fear anything good that came too easily. The other, the mother who only had to think of her child's face to be willing to cross every line. By late morning, as she stood washing her hands at the sink and looked at her calloused fingers beneath the cold water, she already knew what her answer would be. Not because she was no longer afraid, but because there are fears even greater than that fear. The fear that one day she might have to watch her child go without, while knowing she had once been given a chance to change everything. She dried her hands, took out her phone, and sent Tomas only 3 words, saying that she agreed. The gleaming black car carried Renata out of the city on a weekend afternoon, rolling along the winding coastal road until it stopped before a solemn gray stone mansion tucked among the pine trees, where the steady sound of waves rose from below the cliffs and the salt wind blew her hair loose around her face. She stepped out, clutching the cloth bag that held her grandmother's recipe notebook against her chest, as though holding a protective charm. And Tomas was already waiting on the front steps, guiding her through a quiet hallway into the largest kitchen she had ever seen, where everything was so polished and orderly that she almost didn't dare touch anything. She was standing there studying the rows of spices arranged in perfect lines when Adriano walked in, silent in the very same way he had appeared in the restaurant kitchen that night. And this time she had prepared herself better, but his presence still made the air in the room seem to thicken. "You came," he said, and there was something in his voice different from before, less cold, almost like a hidden relief. Renata lowered her head slightly, both hands still holding the bag. "I'm not sure I deserve this job, sir. I've never been head chef for any dinner party." He looked at her for a long while, then walked to the large wooden table at the center of the kitchen and placed on it a long box made of dark wood, carefully polished. "Open it," he said. She hesitated, then set her bag down and lifted the lid, and her breath caught when she saw inside a beautiful set of professional baking tools, their stainless steel finishes shining neatly against dark velvet, with her name engraved on the handle of each knife in fine letters. Renata, quiet and solemn. "I can't accept this," she said at once, stepping back as though the gift might burn her hands, because she knew far too well that expensive gifts from men like him always came with some price she couldn't afford to pay. Adriano shook his head slightly, one corner of his mouth lifting in something almost like a smile. "This isn't a gift," he said, his voice calm, but leaving no room for argument. "These are tools for your work. A good baker deserves proper tools. I'm not giving you anything. I'm simply equipping the person who will stand in my kitchen." The way he said it unsettled her, because it was cold like a statement of business, yet hidden inside it was a kind of recognition no one had ever given her before. A recognition that she was a craftswoman, not merely an ordinary hired worker. And that touched some corner of her heart she had forgotten she still had. She reached out and picked up one of the tools, feeling its balanced weight fit perfectly in her calloused palm, and for the first time in a very long while, her hands didn't feel like the hands of someone fighting only to survive, but the hands of someone who knew what she was doing. "Thank you," she said softly, and when she lifted her eyes, she met his gaze fixed on her with an attentiveness that made her heart beat faster. A look with no insult in it at all, but the opposite, full of respect, so much so that she had to quickly lower her eyes to hide her own disturbance. Adriano stepped back toward the door, telling her to prepare for the evening as freely as she wished, then paused at the threshold and turned his head to add that tonight's guests weren't ordinary people, that she only needed to concern herself with the kitchen and not pay attention to anything else. When he disappeared, Renata stood alone in the unfamiliar kitchen, the knife set bearing her name lying before her, the sea murmuring outside, and suddenly she had the very clear feeling that she had just crossed some threshold from which there would be no way back. That evening, the seaside mansion blazed with lights and was crowded with guests whom Renata understood at a glance were not ordinary people. Men in expensive suits with guarded eyes, moving in small groups and speaking in low voices that were difficult to hear. And only later would she vaguely understand that this was not a cheerful party at all, but a tense meeting between factions that had never cared for one another, a kind of truce negotiation with Adriano serving as host. And the refined meal itself was the way he displayed his position. Renata buried herself in the kitchen for hours, her hands moving swiftly with the set of knives bearing her name, and she cooked with everything her grandmother had passed down to her, dishes carrying the flavors of a faraway land across the ocean, ending with golden-baked egg tarts fragrant with Ceylon cinnamon, the very thing that had opened the door to everything. When the pastries were brought out, she heard murmurs of admiration drifting in from the dining room, and a server hurried in to say that the guests wanted to meet the person who had made them, so despite her hesitation, she wiped her hands and stepped out, softly humming out of unconscious habit, the Azores lullaby she always sang whenever she was tense. The crowd parted a little, and amid the polite compliments, she suddenly noticed an older man standing apart from the others, his silver hair neatly combed, his weathered face marked by cold, sharp eyes, and he was staring at her with a face growing paler by the moment, as though he had just seen a ghost. The man set down the half-eaten pastry in his hand, slowly approached her, and when the melody she was humming reached his ears, his hand trembled slightly. "That song," he said, his voice hoarse and carrying a heavy accent from the old country. "Who taught you that song? And this pastry? This flavor? Where did you learn it?" Renata stepped back half a step in confusion, not understanding why a question that seemed so casual would be spoken with such frightening urgency. "My grandmother taught me," she answered. The song and the recipe both came from her. The man's eyes narrowed, digging through every line of her face as if searching for something. "Your grandmother," he pressed. "What was her name, and where did she come from?" Before Renata could speak, a hand settled on her shoulder, steady and firm, and Adriano's voice sounded right beside her, cold as steel. "She is my head chef tonight, Mr. Borsato. Nothing more and nothing less. Enjoy the food, and don't bother the people in my kitchen." The air between the two men thickened in an instant. An underground hostility Renata could feel clearly, even though she didn't understand where it came from, and the man named Borsato only curled his lips into a thin smile, lowered his head with false courtesy, then stepped back. But his eyes never left her until Adriano guided her away into the hallway. When only the two of them remained in a quiet corner, he turned to her, his face more serious than ever, his hand still resting lightly near her elbow as though afraid she might vanish. "Listen to me," he said softly but firmly. "That man's name is Gianni Borsato. You absolutely must not speak to him, must not be alone with him, must not answer any of his questions. Do you understand?" Renata nodded, her heart beating wildly, and when she looked into those dark eyes now lit with real worry, she suddenly understood that her grandmother's name was not simply a name, but the key to something far more dangerous than anything she had ever imagined. When the last guests had finally left, and the mansion had sunk into silence, Adriano led Renata out to a stone terrace overlooking the night sea, where the salt wind blew fiercely, and moonlight scattered silver across the water, and he stood with his back to her for a long while before speaking, as though weighing how much of a secret he had kept hidden for far too long he should open to her. "Did you bring your grandmother's notebook?" he asked, and when she nodded and took out the cloth bag she had clutched tightly all evening, he told her to guard it more carefully than her own life. Renata didn't understand, and she said plainly that she didn't understand, that it was only an old recipe notebook with yellowed pages and handwritten lines in the language of their homeland, the kind her grandmother had written down over a lifetime. Adriano turned back, his eyes in the darkness carrying something both grave and sorrowful. It isn't only a recipe notebook, he said slowly. The notes in the margins that you've always thought were your grandmother's cooking tips, the numbers, the lines that seem meaningless between the recipes, are actually a kind of code. Your grandmother hid inside it the clues leading to a place where certain documents were kept, documents many people would be willing to give up everything to possess, or to burn. Renata let out a small laugh, more frightened than amused, because what he was saying sounded so absurd it seemed to have stepped out of a novel, but that laugh faded when she saw the absolute seriousness on his face. "What documents?" she asked, her voice beginning to tremble. "And why would my grandmother, a woman who spent her whole life in kitchens, have to hide something like that?" Adriano drew in a deep breath, then began to tell her, and each word he spoke was like a brick laying down a past she had never known she belonged to. He told her that 20 years ago, in the land across the ocean where her family had come from, there was a family named Cardoso, a respected bloodline that controlled important shipping routes and business connections, and her grandmother, Aurora Cardoso, had been a member of that family. He told her there had been an ambitious man who coveted everything the Cardoso family owned, a man who had built lies, fabricated evidence of betrayal, and then, in the name of punishment, brought down a terrible disaster upon that family, one horrifying night in which nearly the entire bloodline was wiped out, with only a few survivors escaping and drifting to a distant country under new names and a buried past. "That man," Adriano said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "is Gianni Borsato, the man who looked at you tonight as if he had seen a ghost. He thought he had buried the truth along with the whole Cardoso family. But your grandmother survived, and before she fled, she managed to hide the evidence that could expose his crimes. Evidence proving that the accusations from all those years ago were lies, that the true traitor was Borsato himself. And she encoded the path to that evidence into the one thing she trusted would be passed down through generations, without anyone suspecting it: the family's cooking recipes." Renata stood frozen, her hands gripping the cloth bag so tightly her knuckles turned white, and a storm of emotions rose inside her. Because this meant she wasn't who she had always believed herself to be, that the gentle grandmother who had once lulled her to sleep with sad songs had carried a terrible secret for her entire life, that the blood running through her, and through little Saul as well, was the blood of a family destroyed because of another man's greed. "Why now?" she whispered. "Why are you only telling me all of this now?" And Adriano looked at her with a gaze heavy with feeling, answering that until the night she sang that lullaby in his kitchen, even he hadn't known that the last survivor of the Cardoso bloodline was standing right in front of him. That night, when Renata returned to the small apartment, after tiptoeing in to kiss Sol's sleeping forehead and making sure her daughter's breathing was steady, she couldn't close her eyes at all. She sat down at the old dining table beneath the dim yellow light and opened her grandmother's recipe notebook with eyes entirely different from before. The yellowed pages were so familiar that she could have read them with her eyes closed. And yet now every careful line of her grandmother's Portuguese handwriting suddenly seemed full of mystery, and for the first time she noticed the numbers, the brief phrases tucked between the recipes that all these years she had assumed were notes about oven temperature or how long to let dough rise. She followed each page slowly, her palm gliding over the paper as though speaking with the dead, until her eyes stopped at the margin of a page containing a sweet bread recipe, where her grandmother had written a string of numbers, and beside it the name of a street and a sequence of characters Renata had always thought was the name of some rare spice. But tonight, after everything Adriano had told her, her mind began working in another way, and when she read carefully the address hidden inside those lines, a chill ran down her spine, because that street name, that district near the old harbor, was a place she had heard of, a place she had been to, a place where she had once stood and cried. Her heart began to pound, her hands trembling as she turned the page back and forth, trying to convince herself that it was only a coincidence, that her exhausted mind was deceiving her. But the longer she looked, the clearer and more merciless the truth became, until she could no longer deny it. The address her grandmother had encoded in the notebook, the place where the evidence Borsato longed to burn had been hidden, was the old warehouse district by the harbor, the very same place where, 2 years earlier, on a bitterly cold winter night, her husband had fallen. Renata let go of the notebook, pressing both hands over her mouth to stop a sob from breaking out in the middle of the night, and the pieces she had buried for 2 years suddenly fitted themselves together into a picture that made her blood run cold. Her husband had been working an extra night security job at that very warehouse district to earn more money for their little family, and people had told her it was a fire, an unfortunate accident caused by an electrical short, that he hadn't been able to escape in time, and for 2 years she had held on to that explanation like a silent grief, had wept for the cruel misfortune of fate, had blamed herself for letting him take that extra shift. But now, sitting alone beneath the dim yellow light with her grandmother's notebook open before her, she understood that there had been no accident at all. The fire that night hadn't been caused by fate, but by the hands of men searching for the documents hidden in that warehouse district. Borsado's men had gone there looking for what her grandmother had concealed 20 years earlier, and her husband, the gentleman who had only happened to be in the wrong place at the most unjust moment, had paid with his life for a secret he hadn't even known existed. Renata lowered her head onto the table, her shoulders shaking with sobs, and this pain was unlike any pain she had ever tasted, because it was no longer the sorrow of a random loss, but the numbing fury of a hidden truth, of knowing that the man she loved had been stolen from her not by chance, but by another man's crime. For 2 years she had cried over an accident, only to discover that she had been crying over a murder. And in that moment, inside the cramped apartment, while her child slept peacefully in the next room, something in that woman's heart changed quietly and forever. The next morning, when Renata called Adriano, her voice still hoarse from staying awake all night, and told him what she had discovered about the address in the notebook, he was silent for a long while on the other end of the line, then said in a firm voice that allowed no refusal that from the moment Borsado saw her at the dinner, she and her daughter were no longer safe in that small apartment, and that he would take the two of them to a discreet place until everything was resolved. Renata had meant to object, had meant to say she couldn't simply abandon her life like that, but when she thought of the cold eyes of that silver-haired man, and of the fact that men like him had taken her husband from her, fear for Saul crushed every hesitation at once, and she agreed. The place Adriano brought the mother and daughter to was a warm wooden house deep in a quiet countryside, far from the city, with windows looking out over a wide grassy field and a sun-filled yard, and from the very first moment she stepped inside, Renata guardedly studied every corner, her heart still uneasy with the feeling that she was being kept inside a beautiful cage. But what slowly softened her was Sol's face, because the 5-year-old girl, who was used to the cramped apartment and the suffocating air of the city, now cried out in delight when she saw the wide yard and the butterflies fluttering beyond the window, and for the first time in a very long while, Renata saw her child smile with an innocent, unburdened joy. The older woman who looked after the house, a kind housekeeper named Marta, welcomed the mother and daughter with hot cookies and a tenderness that made Sol immediately cling to her, and within only a few days, that wooden house began to feel less like a strange refuge and more like the shape of a home. The most miraculous thing, the thing that softened Renata's mother heart little by little, was Sol's health. The clean country air, the quiet without smoke or dust, the warm and proper meals, all of it seemed like a gentle medicine, and she began to notice that her daughter breathed more easily, that the wheezing nights grew fewer and fewer, then almost disappeared, and that the child's cheeks took on a healthy rosy color Renata hadn't seen in so long. One afternoon, as she stood in the kitchen looking out at the yard and saw Sol running happily after a white butterfly, the clear sound of her daughter's laughter drifting in through the open window, Renata suddenly had to stop what she was doing because emotion rose inside her, because she realized how long it had been since her child had truly been allowed to live the life of a child, to run, to breathe, to be happy without fearing an attack of breathlessness in the middle of the night. Adriano wasn't often there. He came and went quietly, handling matters Renata wasn't allowed to know about, but each time he stopped by, she noticed how strangely his gaze softened when he watched Sol playing, as if that sight touched some hidden place, deep inside the man who had seemed frozen solid. She still kept her caution close, still reminded herself that this man belonged to a world she didn't understand and shouldn't trust too easily, but she also couldn't deny that here, for the first time in 2 years, she slept through an entire night without being startled awake by the sound of her child struggling to breathe, without lying there counting numbers in her head, without bracing herself to fight the whole world alone. And one night, as she tucked the blanket around Sol and heard her daughter whisper that she liked this place, that she wished they could stay here forever, Renata sat silently beside her child's bed for a long time, her heart tangled between a caution that hadn't faded and a truth she was beginning to have to admit, that this place, though created in the middle of danger, didn't feel like a prison at all. but more like a home than anywhere she had known since the day her husband had gone. One rainy evening, after Sol had fallen deeply asleep and Marta had withdrawn to her room, Adriano stopped by the wooden house with a weariness Renata had rarely seen in him, and Renata, following an impulse even she couldn't explain, invited him into the kitchen with her while she prepared a batch of pastries for the following morning. He sat down on the stool beside the kitchen counter, silently watching her knead the dough beneath the warm light, and perhaps it was the stillness of the kitchen at night, perhaps it was the scent of flour and cinnamon mingling in the air, that softened something inside him, because after a long silence, he began to speak, his voice low and distant, as though echoing from some very deep place in the past. He told her that his mother too had once been a woman who sang in the kitchen, that she too had made pastries filled with the same warm scent of cinnamon, the very scent that had made him freeze the night he first met Renata, and that was why her small pastry had touched a wound he had believed he had buried forever. Renata stopped moving and listened, and he went on to tell her that when he was still a boy, one terrible night had taken his mother from him in a sea of fire, a blaze set by his father's enemies as a warning, and during that fateful moment, young Adriano had rushed in to find his mother, and had been left with the long scar down his left arm, a mark he had never told anyone about in all these years. Renata looked down at his forearm, where the old burn scar lay faintly beneath his sleeve, and a deep tenderness rose in her heart, because she understood better than anyone what it meant to have fire steal away someone you loved. And in that moment, between two people who seemed to belong to completely different worlds, an invisible thread of sympathy quietly tied itself between them, the thread of those who carried wounds made by flame. After that night, Adriano said, his eyes fixed on empty space, my father taught me one thing. He repeated it until it sank into my blood and bones, that attachment is weakness, that loving someone means handing your enemy a knife to drive into your heart. He said my mother was the reason he had become vulnerable, and he didn't want me to make the same mistake. So I grew up into a man who didn't allow himself to become attached to anything, didn't allow himself softness, because I believed that was the only way to survive. Renata went still before that raw confession, and she suddenly understood why his face was always covered in a layer of ice, why he moved like a shadow no one was allowed to touch. It wasn't innate cruelty, but rather the armor a wounded child had put on to protect himself for his entire life. She didn't say much. She only quietly pushed a handful of dough and a mold toward him, inviting him to try making one with her, and he, the powerful man who had never let anyone order him around, awkwardly followed each of her instructions like a schoolboy. The first pastry he shaped came out crooked and broke apart when he placed it into the mold, and he frowned in irritation as though that tiny failure were unacceptable. But Renata only laughed gently and told him that baking was like life. If it went wrong, you made it again. No one died from ruining a batch of pastries. What mattered was daring to knead it from the beginning once more. He looked at her for a long while after those words, something trembling in those dark eyes. Then he picked up the dough again and tried a second time, more patiently, and when the second pastry finally held its shape and rested neatly in the mold, he looked up at her with a real smile, a rare smile without a trace of ice, and in the small warm kitchen in the middle of the rainy night, both of them realized that they were healing each other in a way no words ever could. A few days later, on a morning when Sol was absorbed in drawing pictures in the sunny yard under Marta's watchful care, Adriano invited Renata into the small study of the wooden house and spread out on the desk before her everything he had gathered, then told her plainly that it was time for her to make a decision, because the situation couldn't remain suspended like this forever, and whatever path she chose, he would respect it. He laid out 3 paths before her, each one carrying its own price and its own future. The first path, he said, was to disappear completely. He had the means to create a new identity for her and Sol in some distant place where no one could find them, a peaceful home, enough financial security for the mother and daughter to live their whole lives without worry, but the price was that she would have to cut herself off from her entire past, from her real name, from everything that belonged to her old life, and Borsato would continue living comfortably like an innocent man, while his crimes stayed buried forever. The second path was to hand the notebook and the documents over to him, so he could use them in the way of the world he belonged to, and then she and Sol would live under his protection, safe but limited, always watched over. A sheltered life, but never a truly free one. And the third path, he said slowly, was to use that evidence to bring Borsato into the light through legal means, to make the truth public, to demand justice for the Cardoso family and for her husband as well. But this was also the most dangerous path, one that would require her to step out of the darkness and face a ruthless enemy directly, placing herself in his sights. Renata sat in silence, her hands clasped together on the desk, and this time she didn't cry, didn't panic, but began to think with a clarity and coldness she had never imagined herself capable of, because this was no longer only about her, but about her daughter's future. She considered the first path, imagining herself leading Sol to a foreign place under a name that wasn't her own, living an entire life nervously looking over her shoulder, and she wondered whether she could teach her daughter to live honestly when the very foundation of the child's life was built on a lie, whether she could look into her child's eyes every day knowing that the man who had killed her father was still walking free out there. She considered the second path, and although the safety it promised held a powerful temptation for an exhausted mother like her, she understood that it would be a life of endless dependence, forever inside a cage no matter how beautiful, and that handing the truth over to the underworld also meant giving up the right to see justice carried out in the open, properly and honorably. Then she thought of the third path, the path that made her heart beat faster with fear, but also with a strange feeling she hadn't had in a very long time, the feeling of someone who had the right to choose her own fate. She thought of her grandmother, who had risked her life to preserve the truth for 20 years in the hope that one day it would be exposed. She thought of her husband, who had fallen unjustly, with no one held responsible even now, and she thought of Sol, of what kind of legacy she wanted to leave her child. A legacy of running away, or a legacy of courage and justice. When she lifted her eyes to Adriano, her gaze had changed. It no longer held the fear of the waitress who had carried plates that night, but a calm determination. And she said she needed a little more time to be certain. But deep in her heart, she already knew she hadn't been born to run, and that the price of safety bought by burying the truth was a price she could never pay. That night, after Sol had fallen into a deep sleep in the warm room upstairs, Renata went down to the kitchen to get her daughter a glass of water in case she woke, and on her way back, as she passed the half-closed door of the study, she accidentally heard Adriano and Tomas's voices drifting out, low and tense, making her freeze in the darkness of the hallway. "The old channels are still there," Tomas said. "There are still people loyal to you, still connections from the old days. All you have to do is give the order, and everything can be handled the old way, clean and fast, without any court involved." Renata's heart tightened, and in that moment, all of Dolores's warnings, all the fears she had tried to smother, suddenly rushed back over her like a cold wave, because those words seemed to confirm what she had always secretly feared, that the man she was slowly beginning to trust was still part of the very world that had destroyed her life, that perhaps he was no different from Borsato, only standing on the opposite side. She stood rooted in place, the glass of water trembling in her hand, and a bitter disappointment rose into her throat, because she had almost trusted him, had almost allowed her hardened heart to open to a man who might only have been using her and her grandmother's secret for his own calculations. But then Adriano's voice sounded, and what he said made her go still all over again. "No," he answered, firm and cold. "I cut those channels off a long time ago, Tomas, and I won't go back to them, not even for this. I spent years pulling myself out of the world my father locked me into, and that's exactly why Borsato sees me as a thorn in his side, because a man like me walking away from the old path is a threat to all of them. If I handle this the old way, I'll be no different from the men who killed my mother, killed her husband, killed the entire Cardoso bloodline. She chose the light, and I'll walk that road with her, no matter how hard it is." Renata stood silently behind the door, and the disappointment inside her dissolved, giving way to something else, warm and choking, because what she had just heard was not the voice of a man using her, but the voice of a human being fighting to hold on to the last decent part of himself, a man who had chosen to give up the power and safety of the old road in order to stand beside her on the side of truth. She quietly went back upstairs, placed the glass of water beside her daughter's bed, and sat there watching Sol sleep deeply, her breathing steady now, no longer wheezing, and in Renata's mind, every final piece became clear. She understood that her caution all this time had been justified, but she also understood that there were people willing to pay the price to change, and that Adriano, in his own scarred way, was trying to become a man better than his past. She gently stroked her daughter's hair and thought about the future she wanted to give her. A future not bought with blood or built on running away, but raised on a clean foundation, where integrity was restored, and the truth was spoken without fear. Then every hesitation inside her disappeared, and Renata knew with certainty that she would stay, that she would follow the road of light she had chosen to the end, not only to seek justice for her grandmother and her husband, but so that one day she could look into Sol's eyes and tell her child that her mother hadn't stepped back. Borsato was not the kind of man who sat still and waited for his opponent to move, and only a few days after realizing the threat Renata's existence carried, he struck first with a blow far more vicious and calculated than anything she had imagined. One morning, Tomas came to the wooden house with a grave expression and placed a local newspaper and a stack of papers in front of Renata. And when she read them, the blood in her body seemed to freeze, because there was an article openly smearing her, accusing her of being a thief who had taken advantage of trust to steal property from her workplace, along with insinuations that she was an untrustworthy woman, an opportunist trying to cling to powerful people. Worse still, Borsato had used his connections and his money to start an entire legal machine against her, fabricating false evidence of embezzlement, pushing her toward the risk of prosecution, and most poisonous of all, sowing doubt about her character as a human being, so that anything she might later say about his crimes would become worthless in the eyes of the public and the law. Renata sat frozen, her hands trembling as she turned through those pages full of lies, and she understood at once that this was a carefully calculated move, because if her honor was blackened first, then when she stood up to accuse Borsato, people would only see the words of a thief slandering a respected man, and her grandmother's truth would be drowned beneath a sea of suspicion. When Adriano heard the news and arrived, his anger rose visibly, though he tried to restrain it, his face hardening into the dangerous coldness Renata had seen when they first met, and he paced the room like an animal driven into a corner. "I can end this," he said, his voice low and sharp. "I have ways to make Borsato go silent, to make him withdraw every accusation before sunset. One meeting, one message delivered to the right place, and he'll understand that touching you was a mistake." Renata looked at him, and she knew very well what he was implying. The old world with its ruthless rules, the very world he had walked away from, and she understood that he was offering it because of her, because of the fury he felt at seeing her framed. But that was exactly why she had to stand firm. "No," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "If we answer him in his own way, with threats and darkness, then we're no different from him. And everything my grandmother protected, everything my husband paid for with his life, will become meaningless. I don't want to defeat Borsato by becoming another version of him. I want to win with the truth, openly, in the light, so that no one can ever say my justice is stained with mud too." Adriano stopped pacing and looked at her for a long time, and she saw the anger in his eyes gradually settle, giving way to something almost like respect, because the woman standing before him, though cornered, smeared, and threatened, still refused to trade her principles for an easy victory. "Do you understand how dangerous the path you've chosen really is?" he asked softly. "Borsato has an entire network of lawyers, newspapers, people willing to lie for money. Facing him in the light means you'll have to be stronger than all those lies." Renata lifted her head high, and in that moment she was no longer the fearful woman who once shrank into herself, but someone who had found her strongest weapon. "Then we'll make the truth stronger," she replied. "Because a hidden crime only holds power as long as everyone remains afraid." Instead of sitting still and waiting for Borsato's machine to crush her, Renata began to act, and for the first time in this entire story, she was no longer the person being dragged along by the current, but the one steering her own boat. She remembered that 2 years earlier, in the middle of her grief over losing her husband, a journalist had come looking for her, a woman named Camila Duarte, who worked for an independent investigative newspaper. Someone who had never believed the fire in the Harbor Warehouse district was simply an electrical accident, as the official conclusion claimed. At the time, Renata had been too shattered to care about the reporter's suspicions, had refused to talk, and let the story slip into oblivion. But now, with everything she knew, she understood that Camila's instinct back then hadn't been wrong at all, and she decided to find the woman herself. Their meeting took place in a small, discreet cafe, and when Renata told her everything, from her grandmother's notebook, to the code hidden inside the recipes, to the address that matched the place where her husband had died, Camila's eyes lit with the glow of an investigator who had finally found the missing piece she had been searching for over many years. "I always knew something was wrong with that fire," Camila said, her voice filled with certainty. "I dug through that file for 2 years, and kept running into invisible walls. Witnesses who suddenly changed their statements. Documents that disappeared. But now I understand why. If what you're saying is true, this isn't just a fire. It's a thread stretching back 20 years. And if we can trace the evidence your grandmother hid, we can expose everything. Together, Renata and Camila began decoding the notebook, and with Adriano's quiet support and security, they followed the numbers and symbols her grandmother had left behind, fitting each piece together like solving a puzzle the dead had sent forward to the next generation. During the long nights spent bent over the old notebook, Renata gradually realized that her grandmother hadn't hidden only one address, but had left behind an entire delicate map of instructions, leading to a box of documents safely stored inside a rented vault under a false name at an old bank, a place the fire in the warehouse district all those years ago couldn't reach because Borsato's men had searched in the wrong place. When they finally opened that box, inside was everything Aurora Cardoso had risked her life to preserve. Ledgers, letters, photographs, and statements proving that years earlier Borsato himself had been the true traitor, the man who had fabricated evidence to frame and destroy the Cardoso family so he could seize everything they owned. Renata held those time-yellowed pages in her hands, and she felt as though her grandmother's hand were resting on her shoulder, as though she could hear the old woman whispering that at last, someone had carried on what she had entrusted to the future. In that moment, the transformation inside her was complete. The woman who had once timidly wiped down the kitchen door in the night, who had once lowered her head in fear before the eyes of powerful men, now stood with her back straight, a stack of evidence in her hands, and a clear plan in her mind, no longer a pawn moved by others, but the person guiding the game herself. She and Camila laid out every step, deciding they wouldn't release the story in haste, but would prepare it carefully, strengthen every piece of evidence, so that when the truth was made public, it would stand as solid as stone, and none of Borsato's web of lies could shake it. And watching Renata work with such sharpness and calm, even Adriano had to admit that the woman he had once thought he was protecting had never truly needed anyone to save her. She only needed the chance to save herself. The confrontation was arranged in a solemn conference room inside a neutral building in the middle of the city, a place that belonged to no side. And Renata had prepared for that moment with every ounce of care she possessed, leaving Sol behind in the safe refuge under her aunt's loving watch, so her mind could focus completely on the battle ahead, without being tangled in fear for her child. Present in the room was a retired judge known for his integrity, whom Camila trusted enough to invite as a witness, the journalist herself with a recorder and a stack of verified documents, Adriano standing silently to one side like a steady shadow, and across from them sat Gianni Borsato, with his group of polished lawyers in gleaming suits, his face still wearing the arrogance of a man who believed money and power could silence any threat. When Renata entered and sat down, Borsato curled his lip in contempt and said he didn't understand why he had to waste his time on the baseless accusations of a thief, but Renata didn't flinch. She placed her grandmother's recipe notebook on the table, and beside it, the time-yellowed documents taken from the safe, then began to speak in a voice so calm it surprised even herself. She laid out each layer of the truth, from the Cardoso family being framed and destroyed 20 years earlier, to the evidence proving Borsato himself had fabricated the old accusation of betrayal, and each time she opened another document, the judge leaned down to examine it carefully, his face growing more serious by the moment, while Borsato's lawyers began exchanging uneasy glances. Borsato tried to interrupt, loudly calling it all a fabrication, forged papers, but Camila calmly presented forensic results, confirming the age and authenticity of every document, along with statements from witnesses she had quietly tracked down again after many years, and the wall of lies he had spent so long building began to crack piece by piece. Then Renata stood, placed the final piece on the table, the harbor warehouse address encoded in the notebook, and she looked straight into Borsato's eyes as she said that at that very place, on a winter night 2 years earlier, his men had come to hunt down and burn these documents, and that her husband, an innocent security guard who had only happened to be there by chance, had died in that fire. Borsato's face changed for an instant, his arrogance cracking for the first time, and in the fury of a man who knew he had been cornered, he suddenly sprang to his feet, one of his men lunging toward the table to snatch the documents. But in a flash, Adriano and the judge's security guards had restrained him, restoring control quickly and decisively before anything worse could happen, while the evidence remained untouched on the table under everyone's eyes. In the silence after the chaos settled, Renata still stood straight, not stepping back even once, and she spoke, this time with no tremor in her voice, clear enough to reach every person in the room. "You thought power meant making people stay silent," she said, her eyes never leaving Borsato. "You thought that with enough money, enough fire, enough lies, any truth could be buried. But you were wrong. My grandmother hid this truth inside recipes for 20 years, passed it on through a lullaby you never would have suspected, and it survived your fire, your slander, and everything you did to erase it. Truth is the one thing you can't buy, can't burn, and can't kill. Today it stands here in front of you, and this time, no one will ever silence it again." The room fell into a heavy silence, and the judge slowly removed his glasses, looking at the evidence, then at Borsato, with eyes that already held an answer, and in that moment, the woman who had once quietly carried plates in the middle of the night made an entire room full of powerful people fall silent before the weight of the truth. What happened after that confrontation spread faster than any fire Borsato had ever set, because with verified evidence in the hands of an honest judge and a determined investigative journalist, the truth finally found its way into the light, and nothing could stop it anymore. Camila published her investigative series. Each piece of the story from 20 years ago laid bare before the public, and the doors Borsato had once believed were locked tight with money and power began to open one after another. The authorities stepped in, and an official investigation was reopened, not only into the old false accusations against the Cardoso family, but also into the warehouse fire at the harbor that had taken Renata's husband's life. The empire Borsato had spent years building on a foundation of lies and fear began to crack from within. Those who had once bowed beneath him now turned away to save themselves. His expensive lawyers withdrew one by one, and the man who had once looked at Renata with contempt now found himself surrounded by the very thing he feared most, truth spoken openly in public, something no amount of money could buy back. Borsato didn't fall because of a bullet or a fire, but because of the weight of the crimes he had committed, finally crashing down over him after 2 decades of hiding. One afternoon, when the storm of public outrage had begun to settle and Renata returned to the wooden house, she found Adriano standing alone by the window, looking out over the field, and there was something in the way he stood that made her pause at the doorway. When he turned back, his dark eyes looked at her with a tenderness and a trace of wonder she had never seen before. "I thought I brought you here to protect you," he said softly. "I thought I was the one sheltering you and Sol, the one who would solve everything for you. But I was wrong. You didn't need anyone to save you. You were the one who did what I never dared to do my whole life. Dared to believe in the truth, dared to choose the light instead of the dark, even when the dark was so much easier." Renata stepped closer to him, and she saw that something in the face of the man who had once been as cold as ice had fully melted, the armor he had worn all his life seeming to have fallen away. "For so many years, my father taught me that attachment was weakness," he continued, his voice tightening. "That to survive, a man had to freeze his own heart. I believed that, until I heard you singing in the kitchen that night, until I watched you stand up to a man 100 times more powerful than you without trembling. You showed me that daring to love, daring to trust, isn't weakness. It's the greatest strength a human being can have. You didn't only save your grandmother's honor and reclaim justice for your husband, Renata. You saved the human part of me too, the part I thought had died with my mother in the fire all those years ago." The two of them stood there, very close together in the golden afternoon light spilling through the window, and Renata reached out to touch his forearm gently, right where the old scar lay hidden beneath the fabric, the tender gesture of someone who understood what it meant to carry a wound that never fully healed. He quietly placed his hand over hers, without another word, but inside that warm silence was everything they had not yet had time to say, a deep understanding between two people who had both lost too much to fire and had now found a home in each other. No confession of love was spoken, and none needed to be, because in that gentle, complete moment, they both understood that they had walked through darkness together and stepped into the light together, and that the fragile thing blooming between them, raised from wounds and healing, would be the beginning of something neither of them had ever dared to dream of. 1 year passed, and Boston had dressed itself in a new spring when the door of a small bakery on a quiet street in the North End opened to customers for the first time, and on the wooden sign hanging out front was carved a simple name filled with meaning: Aurora's. The case from all those years ago had finally reached its end. The justice Renata's grandmother had risked her life to protect for 20 years was finally carried out. The honor of the Cardoso family was restored after 2 decades of being buried beneath slander, and her husband's death was no longer hidden under the cover of an accident, but had been called by its true name, with those responsible made to answer before the law. Renata no longer carried inside her the numb fury of those earlier days, and in its place was a gentle peace, because she knew she had done what needed to be done, had returned to the dead the fairness they deserved, and now she could remember her husband not with the pain of a loss concealed by lies, but with the comfort of knowing that the truth about him had finally been brought into the light. Aurora's quickly became a special place, not only because of the fragrant Ceylon cinnamon egg tarts made from her family recipe, the kind that drew customers from far away, but because of what happened behind that pastry counter. Renata had turned her cherished dream into reality, using this very place to teach baking for free to single mothers struggling with life the way she once had. Widowed mothers, women who had just stepped out of hardship, women society had forgotten. She taught them not only how to knead dough and watch the heat, but also how to believe in the worth of their own hands, how to lift their heads in a world used to looking down on poor workers. And each time she watched a shy woman on her first day slowly become confident after a few weeks of training, Renata saw in them the image of herself from 2 years earlier, the woman who had once lowered her head in fear in a borrowed kitchen at midnight. She understood better than anyone that a person's dignity doesn't lie in the work they do or the money they earn, but in the way they hold on to self-respect and kindness through hardship, and she wanted to pass that truth on to every woman who walked through the bakery door. As for Adriano, the man who had once been a powerful shadow in the underworld had also quietly undergone his own transformation, silently cutting away what remained of the past, closing the businesses that belonged to the dark, and moving everything into lawful work, open and honorable beneath the light. He used his resources to support Renata's bakery and the community projects she cared about so deeply, not as a boss handing down favors, but as a man redeeming one piece of his life at a time, step by step rebuilding the person he might have become if the fire years ago hadn't taken his mother from him and pushed him onto a darker road. People still spoke the name Vasco with a trace of caution, but anyone who walked into Aurora's on a morning and saw that tall man quietly helping Renata place trays of warm pastries onto the shelves would surely never imagine that he had once been someone an entire city whispered about. Because now, among the warm scent of cinnamon and the lively laughter of the women learning their trade, the man who had once believed attachment was weakness had found the very thing power and money had never given him in all his life: a place to belong, a reason to wake each morning, and a family he had never dared dream he deserved. On mornings at Aurora's bakery, when the first sunlight slipped through the glass window and the scent of Ceylon cinnamon began to spread through the warm room, people often saw a scene that softened the heart. Little Sol, now 6 years old, healthy and rosy, running busily between the wooden tables with clear laughter that no longer carried even the faintest wheeze from the old days, her chubby cheeks dusted with flour because she kept insisting on helping her mother press the dough into the molds. The little girl who had once struggled for every breath in a cramped apartment was now growing up in a world filled with sunlight and laughter. And every time Renata watched her child run and play, a gratitude beyond words filled her mother's heart. Behind the counter, a sight unfolded every day that perhaps no one who had known the old Adriano Vasco could ever have believed. The man whose name had once made the whole city lower its voice in caution, now standing there in a white apron dusted with flour. The hands once familiar with dark dealings now moving skillfully as they kneaded dough and arranged trays of hot pastries on the shelves. The face that had once been cold as ice now softened by a rare peace. The icy shell from years before had melted completely. The image of a powerful boss had retreated into the past like a nightmare that had ended, and in its place was a man who had found his way back to the decent part of himself. On the wall behind the counter, in the place of greatest honor, hung the baking tools engraved with Renata's name, no longer merely tools for one fearful night of work, but a witness to an entire journey, from the timid waitress carrying plates late at night to the owner of a bakery standing firmly on her own 2 feet. And every afternoon, when the bakery grew quiet, Renata would sit down at the wooden table in the corner with Sol beside her and Adriano across from her, then softly begin the Azores lullaby her grandmother had passed down, the melody that had once been the only thread connecting her to her lost childhood, the melody that had opened everything in that cold kitchen long ago, and now she taught it to her daughter, word by word, so that one day Sol would pass it on to the next generation, keeping the flame of memory and love from ever going out. Adriano listened, sometimes quietly singing along in his deep, awkward voice. And in those simple moments, the circle of the story closed completely. The song that had once hidden a painful secret, now becoming only a song of pure love, rising inside a warm kitchen among people who had walked through darkness together and found their way back to the light. Grandmother Aurora had once told Renata, when she was still a child, that a good recipe didn't lie in expensive ingredients, but in hands brave enough to love, and in a heart placed fully into everything it did. And only after passing through all the loss, fear, and pain did Renata fully understand the meaning of those words. That the most precious things in life weren't power or money, but the dignity to live honestly, the courage to protect the truth, and the love to heal one another and ourselves. Renata's story reminds us that no matter how harsh fate may be, no matter how many times life knocks us down, kindness, resilience, and faith in what is right remain a flame nothing can extinguish. That every person, no matter how poor or small they may seem, deserves respect and carries the strength to change their own destiny. If today's story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so you can listen to many more meaningful and moving stories every day. How do you feel about Renata and Adriano's story? And what part of their journey moved you the most? Please leave a comment below and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear the inner voice of every viewer. I wish everyone watching this video very good health, a joyful life, peace, and love filling every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next stories.